Thanks for tuning in to another show in the Next Reel family of film podcasts.
Want to skip those ads and get early access?
Become a member at TruStory.fm/join and discover all the other great perks that come with it. Welcome to CinemaScope. I'm Andy Nelson. Each episode, we map one genre, subgenre, or film movement, what defines it, what shaped it, and what it influenced. Today, we are diving into post-war paranoia thrillers. These are films built on a single, unsettling premise. The enemy isn't out there. It's in here, among us, maybe inside us. And the Cold War gave Hollywood the perfect system to dramatize that dread. We'll move through the cycle thematically rather than film by film, mapping the DNA of paranoia as a cinematic mode, tracing how it evolved, and asking what it meant that an entire era of filmmaking was built on the question, who can you actually trust? Joining me is Tony Shaw, professor of contemporary history at the University of Hertfordshire and author of Hollywood's Cold War. Tony, welcome to the show.
This is great. Thanks, Andy.
Before we really dig in, I mean, your work sits, particularly with this book, sits right at the intersection of Hollywood and Cold War propaganda. What drew you to looking at that particular territory? And then, I mean, how did this cycle of films kind of fit into this larger story that you've been telling as far as propaganda goes?
Yeah, I'll just go a little back. I studied at Leeds University in the north of England in the 80s, and that was one of the few departments of history at the time which, in a revolutionary way, taught historians how to deal with film and media and how to take cinema seriously, which for a lot of historians, that was quite new. So I learned a lot about the use of film as propaganda in the 1930s and 40s, Goebbels and Nazism, Stalin, communism, etc. And I've sort of carried the baton a little bit by writing about propaganda in the Cold War, in that great battle for hearts and minds after 1945. Plus, I'm a sort of kid of the 70s and 80s, raised on James Bond and Rambo films, this sort of thing. So it's fun to look back at those as an historian. Films which I knew as a child. But more broadly, I'm interested in how the Cold War was won, essentially. And whereas historians used to write that it was won on the battlefield or by diplomacy or by military means, then more recently, historians, especially cultural historians like myself, have said maybe the Cold War was won and lost in the media or on the sports field or in the shopping malls. And in particular, I'm interested in looking at the role of film, and I'm an archive digger. I'm interested in as much as what was going on behind the scenes of these films as much as what appears on the screen. And so these, if we're going to call them perhaps paranoid films of the first 20 years of the Cold War, really fit nicely into that.
Fantastic. That's fascinating to recognize that there's so much to talk about as it comes to propaganda in film, which, I mean, still goes on today. Like it's still, you can still find plenty of examples of propagandistic films. It's not necessarily the same sorts, but I think that there's still arguments to be made with some films that it's more propagandistic than just designed for pure entertainment.
Yeah, that relationship between entertainment and information, or entertainment and persuasion, is at the heart of what I'm doing. And I'm sure, in let's say 20, 30 years to come, there'll be plenty to write about, the war, let's say, between Iran and America at the moment, or between Ukraine and Russia, and the way in which the media has played a really important part in that. Obviously, we're in a period of social media where cinema probably isn't as important as the period that we're going to be talking about today. I mean, certainly when we're talking from the 30s through to the 50s, as we know, cinema was at its height of influence then.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to be talking across 10 films today. Rather than going one by one, we are going to be grouping them thematically to trace what this cycle was doing and how it evolved. And a quick note, this episode, we are releasing the entire conversation to everyone. No member split, no bonus content held back. So here's the full map. We're starting in 1949 with Carol Reed's The Third Man, jumping to 1952 with Leo McCarey's My Son John, 1953, Carol Reed's The Man Between, 1954, John Hollis and Joy Batchelor's Animal Farm. 1955, Peter Glenville's The Prisoner. 1959, Stanley Kramer's On the Beach. 1962, John Frankenheimer's The Manchurian Candidate. 1964, Sidney Lumet's Fail Safe. 1964, also John Frankenheimer's 7 Days in May. And ending with Martin Ritt's 1965 film, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And while there's no member bonus content in this episode, if you would like to support the show and get early access and exclusive content on future episodes, you can join for $5 a month or $55 a year. Just head to trustory.fm/join to learn more. So let's talk a couple minutes about why this is an important, we'll just call it like a mode of paranoia thrillers in this post-war period. It's kind of like right at the hinge of the post-war moment. The war is over. But really, the dread hasn't gone anywhere. And now it's just kind of shifted from, the Nazis to suddenly now we have this Cold War. There's from an external enemy with a face to now this internal threat that might not have one. We looked last episode at how the post-war domestic melodrama turned conformity and repression inward, looking kind of how it moved into the home. The paranoia thrillers turn that pressure outward into institutions, ideology, questions of who you can trust. And, I think that the Cold War is such an interesting backdrop for all of this. It forms the logic of this entire thing. It's the world in which information is weaponized, loyalty is suspect, and the thriller's central mystery shifts from who did it to who controls what you're allowed to know. So I'm just curious from you, just kind of a big picture question, like what is it about this particular historic moment, the late 40s through the mid 60s, that made paranoia such a dominant register, particularly as we're talking in the world of cinema?
Well, the Cold War on screen and the sense of paranoia, one could argue, started way before the end of the Second World War. The Cold War, in a cultural sense, started you could say, obviously, with the Bolshevik Revolution, and Hollywood is involved, and so for that matter, great Soviet filmmakers are making, movies about the enemy, whether it's capitalism or communism, from 1917 onwards. I mean, there are some really interesting Hollywood films, let's say in the 1930s. For instance, a film called Ninotchka in 1939, which is a rom-com about what it was like for a female Soviet envoy to visit Paris, who falls in love with Paris and wants to essentially and does defect to the West. So the Cold War in a cultural or cinematic sense starts way before the Second World War, but of course it heats up after the Second World War. You've got various factors here at play. You've got Hiroshima. In other words, atomic secrets can lead to disaster from that. In other words, there was genuine sense that there were Soviet atom spies in the United States. We now know there were. Not as many as was perhaps Hollywood imagined, but there were, and that did play a role in, think about it, the US becomes the great nuclear superpower in 1945. The American government didn't think the Soviets would be able to themselves get the bomb until probably the mid-1960s. And yet, lo and behold, by 1949, the Soviet Union is a nuclear power. So there's a sense within the American government and amongst the American people that there are subversives within who could have played a role in allowing the Soviet Union, the great enemy by now, to become the major threat. That if those secrets, it's one thing giving espionage or, let's say, spies are working in your midst. It's one thing if they're going to find out about what you might have in your military arsenal. But if that leads to the opposite of the enemy being able to destroy you with bombs in one fell swoop, that's very different indeed. So Hiroshima changes the approach towards war. Then you've got, as I'm sure you've talked about in previous episodes, the the Red Scare, McCarthyism in the period. We're going to largely talk about that and how that affected the United States, but there are elements of that in Britain because we're going to be talking about some British films here. There's no equivalent of Joseph McCarthy in Britain, but there is a sense in the British government that the media has to be looked at, examined, assessed, surveilled, and British filmmakers are influenced by that. Over in the US, the HUAC, of course, is making major attacks on Hollywood, blacklisting. Hollywood's under siege. So that's another element. So I think some filmmakers are reacting to that. They're projecting and perhaps, should we say, being forced to put fears of communism on screen. And like I say, perhaps a sense that, as you perhaps intimated, that the Second World War never ends in many ways. We see a continuation of that huge use of propaganda, historic use of propaganda during the Second World War. It's easy for all governments to carry on with that machinery of propaganda. And the strong relationships that the American government, let's say through the Pentagon or the FBI, had built up during the Second World War with Hollywood could be extended as the Cold War went on. So I think there are lots of things going on, both within the film industry and outside it, to produce a sense of paranoia on screen.
Yeah, and I think like if you look at what had developed, I mean, just looking specifically at Berlin, for example, and how the post-war restructured things and how we had occupation zones, I think that also, like that need to kind of cordon off what was ours, I think also kind of arose from all that, right? With the kind of then suddenly the Iron Curtain and the need to have these intelligence networks that were infiltrating each other's sides, that all kind of felt like it was very much a part of all of that. And I think another element for me that stands out is TV, right? TV really exploded at this point, and suddenly now this question of who controls the image and the ability to shape what people believe, I think that was a huge part of all of this.
Yeah. Not only, in other words, within governments is there a greater attempt to understand the power of the image, and the power of the media, and the need, given that the Cold War is not a war that most people realize could be won militarily. It would be won by psychological means, through hearts and minds. And this idea, you're going back to just there about the occupation zones, the Iron Curtain itself, which people believed was a reality. And of course, it meant, therefore, that you have these two sub-universes, East and West, particularly in Europe, because of a lack of ability to travel from one side to the next, to see into what life was like on the other side. It meant that, espionage was that way more important to find out what the other side was capable of. But cinema and television was that much more influential and important in giving people a picture of what life was really like on the other side. In other words, is to fill the gap left by the fact that these were two closed off societies in many ways. I mean, closed off to one another. And I think cinema, given, seeing is believing, etc., in this conflict, in the Cold War, seeing is believing is all the more important because of the inability of people to travel, to have a real sense of, what is the reality of communism, for instance? What's really going on behind the Iron Curtain? The media fills that vacuum.
I think that's absolutely the case. We're definitely seeing how these mediums for entertainment are suddenly being used for other purposes. I like to talk a lot about kind of like the cinematic family tree, where things fit in this big cinematic family tree. I think that this is an interesting one. Again, it feels very much like, paranoia thrillers, I think, is very much kind of a subgenre of the thrillers anyway. But I think you can also look at what we're talking about, this post-war period, very much kind of a mode within that period. But that certainly drew its influence from film noir, which we also talked about in this mini series that I'm doing. I think there's a lot of distrust. You've got compromised protagonists. The moral terrain feels very unstable in film noir. You can see that it pulled from like the wartime espionage thrillers. Like we had plenty of those coming up during the war. You already mentioned kind of like the other earlier 30s and 40s propaganda. I think there was also some anti-fascist films that we had in that period of time with sleeper threats and things like that. And I think a lot of writers were writing about this that people were pulling from, like Graham Greene and John le Carré, Richard Condon, and things like that. And then also, I think at the same point in time, we're starting to get spy thrillers. And I think we'll certainly talk about how this evolved as we get into the 60s and you get things like James Bond and stuff like that. But, when you look at how it ties into other genres, do you see other themes that it shares with some of these other types of things? Like even 50s sci-fi, you can still see how there are threads that kind of connect these stories to those stories. Like it all feels very much like it's all kind of intertwined.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I know you've had an episode on sci-fi and I don't know how you touched on the Cold War or what extent you did, but clearly sci-fi is part of the state, the fear of what's alien, ideologically or otherwise. So sci-fi, I mean, the crime genre, of course, and quite a number of the films that we might touch on today are, related to crime. Third Man and The Man Between, I think, are good examples of that. So, I mean, would we bring in combat movies? Perhaps not. There are perhaps elements of these which touch on combat movies or perhaps, I mean, certainly those which we deal with when we come to, let's say, looking on the beach.
But even there, it feels like it's more of the mind is the battlefield more than the battlefield is the battlefield, right?
Yeah, that's right. But of course, if you are looking at the nuclear thrillers like On the Beach, then there are military elements to it.
Yeah,
I suppose,
sure.
yes. But in other words, for some filmmakers, for some audiences, I think that they're going to be attracted to those films because of that combat element, perhaps that military element.
Yeah, absolutely. Over this period of time, from the late 40s into the mid 60s, it definitely feels like there's an evolution that we see in what we're getting out of paranoia thrillers. Like as I was thinking about these, like the early ones feel like we're seeing more of kind of the ruined European cities, again, those occupied zones. The threat really is kind of the post-war landscape itself. And then it moves into like more domestic stories that we get the ideological suspicions inside the family and the house as HUAC kind of kicks in and really kind of turns this a very literal thing that everybody's seeing and experiencing. And then it moves into kind of like the whole system is really this dangerous system that could just like end the world, as we're seeing with like On the Beach, Manchurian Candidate, leading to really kind of, I mean, I don't know. It felt to me like The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is really kind of a strong finale for this series, because it's like it's reaching its endpoint with the institutions are kind of indistinguishable in the moral cost that comes along with them. There's no romance at all in any of this sort of stuff. And it speaks to like why perhaps it ended up shifting into things like James Bond, because it's like, okay, we're ready to be done with that. Now we just need to have some fun again. I don't know. Is there more that you would say, looking at kind of the tonal shift over the decades?
Yeah, it's difficult to identify those sorts of, I mean, the idea, for instance, it starts off by focusing on, let's say, ruined Europe, and then moves more to domestic threats. I'm not quite sure about that. I think, so for instance, the first Cold War thriller that Hollywood produced proper, really, after the Second World War was called The Iron Curtain, essentially, and that really focuses it on an espionage threat to Canada, and hence to North America. So I think that the threat within for Hollywood is focused mostly on that throughout this period, really, rather than overseas. But I mean, we can play around with that perhaps and see whether I'm right about that or not. But certainly, I mean, historians talk of there not being one Cold War, but two, in the sense that they argue that the first Cold War starts, let's say, from 1947 with the Truman Doctrine and the Berlin blockade of 1948 through to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which frightened the heck out of everyone. And then there's a thaw, a détente, from the mid-60s through to the late 70s, and then you get Cold War II, from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 through to Gorbachev coming to power in 1985. So I think, in other words, what you're saying there is that the John le Carré film, Spy Who Came In from the Cold, which comes out in the mid-60s, is a sort of endpoint, in other words, or the beginning of something new, perhaps even, i.e., that spies are being, le Carré's film there it's a critique of both sides, of course, and what espionage is doing to everyone. Whereas, in other words, that's, it's more of a détente or peaceful coexistence film. Whereas that first period, whatever, from 1947 through to the early 60s is a high point of what we might call Cold War paranoia.
Yeah, right. Well, let's get into the films themselves. Like I mentioned, we're going to, instead of going one by one, we're going to put them in kind of thematic buckets is kind of what I did. I want to start our first bucket. I called The Landscape of Distrust. This has The Third Man, The Man Between, and The Spy Who Came In from the Cold in it. All three of these are set really in physically divided cities. We've got, again, this morally compromised Cold War geography, Vienna, we see Berlin, and then the landscape really kind of embodies the paranoia and really kind of no heroes, no clean exits in these films. Starting in kind of the cities, these cities that we're looking at in these movies, were literal front lines of early Cold War, physically divided between these ideological blocks that we had. How accurately would you say that these films are capturing kind of what those spaces felt like to people living through these occupations?
Pretty well, I think. Pretty well. And what is interesting about The Third Man and The Man Between in particular, I mean, both, Cara Reed there is going to great lengths to try and capture the reality of effectively divided cities. So Vienna in 1948 is divided by the four powers at the very outset of the Cold War. Berlin in The Man Between by 1953, when that film is released, then you've got a divided Berlin, not a divided Berlin with the Berlin Wall, of course. The wall isn't built until 1961, but it's divided east and west nonetheless. I think Cara Reed does a great job in capturing the destruction of both cities, particularly in The Man Between. I think it captures that really well. And you get some interesting stories, sort of, I've looked into the making of both The Third Man and The Man Between in some detail, and you get some really interesting context for the films, both in terms of what it was like for the filmmakers working in those cities and who had a role. With The Third Man, for instance, I mean, this is both films are produced by Alexander Korda, a big British producer, and the writing of The Third Man, for instance, which is done by Graham Greene, who interestingly worked for MI6, was a spy in World War II. And there are, rumors still, we don't know the truth, but the rumors that Graham Greene wanted to be involved in the writing of The Third Man, so he could go to Austria and Czechoslovakia, where the filming was done, to spy informally on the edge of Moscow's sphere of influence.
Interesting.
Graham Greene knew a guy called Peter Smolka, who was a Times correspondent for Central Europe, who was a probable Soviet mole and a friend of the British Soviet double agent Kim Philby, the guy who defected to the East in 1963. And Philby, I think, provided the inspiration for Harry Lime, for the Orson Welles character.
Interesting.
And Philby was doing similar things to what Harry Lime is portrayed as doing.
Talk about that for a minute, because that was an interesting element with this movie that I think also is something that speaks to just kind of the portrayal of this world, is how it's perhaps easier for people to fall into the crime that they're doing. Like here, Harry is stealing like pharmaceuticals and selling it for profit, and people who are sick are potentially now not getting the medications they need because of this. And I feel like that was an interesting element to this story that isn't treated as like the primary plot, but it certainly is like a core part of what he's up to. And I think that's an interesting piece that we're looking at here, that we're seeing in kind of the way that these stories are being told.
Yeah, he's what the British called in the Second World War in particular a spiv. I don't know whether you've come across that word, but basically a low level criminal who's in a racket, really, and he's trying to make not huge amounts of money, but people who during the Second World War in Britain were profiteering from shortages. So he was seen very much by British audiences as a spiv, as a sort of low-life cinema gangster. And I think in doing that, he connects to the Second World War for audiences, for British audiences in particular, and he seems more real. I mean, Philby, when he was working, Kim Philby, the to-be double agent in the 30s, was helping dissidents escape Vienna through the city's sewers, and he married an Austrian partly to give her the safety of British nationality. And that's a sort of same storyline comes with Harry Lime as well, to an extent. He's a self-seeking opportunist. He's working with the Soviets, but not for the Soviets. So the Cold War themes here are a little more opaque, certainly compared with The Third Man. When you get a good-hearted British major, played by Trevor Howard. So the Brits are presented as good. The Soviets are ruthless in terms of their occupation strategy, but there's no clear civilized West versus totalitarian East. So, I mean, whilst this could be seen as, and I would write, is the first British Cold War film proper, it's not got the clear good and bad, East versus West, is what you would get in later films, and particularly The Man Between, which is a lot more, the messages there are a lot clearer in political terms.
These films all also kind of end with, I don't know, is it fair to say dark resolutions or without resolution? There's, and I feel like that's certainly an element we have in these stories when we look at this, like, I'm just wondering if that feels like kind of the way that they end, kind of a statement in and of itself that it's a dark time and things might get resolved in some capacity, but it's not necessarily a happy ending.
Yeah, I mean that was the intention. I think obviously with the Carré, there's no doubt about that. The film is very close to his book, and I think we're all aware of what the Carré's take on Cold War espionage was. It's a deeply pessimistic interpretation of Cold War, and the same with The Man Between. And maybe there's a part to play in this. You asked me about what it was like to film in these cities or to depict these cities. I think that had a role. I mean, given the divided nature of the cities and the pessimism and the fear that there was, the sense of scrutiny, everyone looking over one another, it probably would have been almost impossible to present a different sort of picture. In the case of all three films, we're trying to project some sort of reality. So I think that the location work has an influence on the political messages and also on the takes of the filmmakers themselves. And none of these filmmakers, none of the directors or the producers of these three films are what we would call, ardent right-wingers. And there are some directors we're going to touch on perhaps in the other films who were. So they didn't want to present a sort of, they wanted perhaps the messiness of the Cold War to be projected on the screen.
Well, speaking of those right-wingers, let's move into bucket B. This I call The Enemy Within. And the films I've put in here are My Son John, Animal Farm, and The Prisoner. We're moving into more intimate spaces, the family home, I guess we'll call it an allegorical collective, the interrogation cell. We don't have a foreign army necessarily that's a threat. It's the person you thought you knew, the ideology you thought you understood, the institution you thought you could trust. I want to start with My Son John, which is a hard film to watch. It is not an easy one. It is so designed to be just kind of like the anti-communist story, the mom who suspects her own son. What does this film reveal about kind of like the HUAC specifically, kind of the cultural climate in Hollywood? I mean, I know Leo McCarey was very much a right-wing filmmaker. This is a very religious story as far as its framing. This son who's abandoned his church and he's gone to school, and that means that he's now a communist. And like the things that this film is saying are pretty dark by today's standards. And I'm curious, like, how does this connect to how anti-communism was being sold? I mean, that's what they're selling this to people who are going to the theaters to watch it.
Yeah, you mentioned HUAC. I mean, there are a number of films that were produced perhaps directly in reaction to HUAC, i.e. certain filmmakers may have wanted to prove that they were loyal to the American cause. I mean, that's not the case with Leo McCarey, as you say. He was a known right-winger, a supporter in many ways of what HUAC was doing or what McCarthy was saying. Very religious, ardent Catholic. And I think there are so many elements of Leo McCarey's own worldview in this film. He wrote it, he produced it, he directed it. You know, it's his movie. And I think that religious angle, presenting John's mother as deeply religious, and she's just broken when she finds out, or what she suspects throughout the film, but finds out at the end that her husband, we'll go on to her husband perhaps in a moment, her favorite son, in many ways, has turned against her religion, is a communist spy, and in other words, couldn't have done anything worse in being unpatriotic and anti-Christian. She's deeply religious. The husband is deeply religious. We see scenes of the father smiting John, the son, with a Bible. You're right about watching this now. I show this to my students and I warn them beforehand. This is a over 2 hour long film, and it's slow. Some elements of it you probably won't get, so we'll have to talk about that. Or we can come up to that in a moment. But they just about hang on in there, and they get a sense of what the film is capturing of the period. The real sense of, I mean, you might call it paranoia. You know, we could question that word overall. I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest that all fear of communism, let's say in the United States in this period, was paranoia. You know, was a myth. There were communists. There weren't many, but there were communists. There were spies, and we don't want to be too dismissive in calling it a sort of a paranoid film or others. But you're right in the sense that the tropes it uses, the way it presents its fear of communism suggests that threat is all encompassing. I think that without doubt comes out here.
It really comes across that way in the film, and it really is interesting in how it's specifically depicting the family and the sons. Like, we have two sons who are not going off to college. They play football, and like they were football all-stars at high school, and now they're joining the army. Or the Navy. They're off to join the military and go overseas to do their part. They are depicted very much as, I guess you would say, kind of the typical American that we wanted to see these boys be. They're religious, everything. again, not getting any additional education. And then you have John, who is the one who did go get educated and who through that has decided to step away from his religious upbringing to find a different path. And in the scope of the film, it happens to be communism, but it really speaks to how McCary saw the delineation of how you got to be a communist. And it speaks against educational institutions for sure, secondary education and everything. And it speaks to just doing whatever your government says and just going along with it. It very much speaks to that mentality.
Yeah. John's two brothers, of course, are not just going to have to join the Navy. They're going to fight in Korea. This is during the Korean War. So they're going to potentially die for their country when they leave. They only have a small role in it at the start of the movie. And then the stage is set for John to appear. Yeah, it's an anti-intellectual picture without doubt. There clearly was a wide spectrum of opinion across the US that Marxists had to be intellectuals. They were overthinking things, if you want to put it that way. And John has been influenced into becoming a communist by his college professor. We never see the college professor up close, but we see him at a distance, interestingly. But he's clearly a bad influence. John talks about him quite a lot. His father is jealous of that. Because, in other words, the professor has become some sort of father figure, as he veiled himself into the family. In other words, the intellectual, the professor has crept into the family to change the family. There's a big issue about what the mother represents. There's a lot of momism here. This is a phrase which was used at the time, and I have to explain to my students that the mother character is Helen Hayes, a big actor, a well-known actress, especially on stage. She came out of retirement to play in this film. She would have attracted, therefore, a lot of people to go and watch it. She's overbearing, and John has become too close to his mother, and has become perhaps too soft, in inverted commas, because of the influence of his mother. In other words, the perception is that some mothers could be too close to their sons and they could make them weak. I don't think there's much doubt whatsoever that, there were hints of this by some reviewers at the time that John is not heterosexual, should we put it that way? So that homophobic element to a lot of American and British Cold War culture, that, in other words, there's a weakness, these people are deviants, whether it's politically or sexually. That is an element within it. So all of these, and again, all of which were not down entirely to Leo McCary, but one can see why McCary might want to be projecting this sort of message. John's a deviant. He's a hypocrite. In other words, he shows no respect to his parents, and ultimately he'll be murdered by his comrades.
Well, it's an interesting. It's a hard film to watch again, but it's an interesting one, and it does pair with like The Prisoner as another example, because here we have a more religion being used as kind of like the battleground, as opposed to like the family suspecting its son. Here we have the state breaking a cardinal and trying to crack down on him. It's another very interesting look that has kind of a little bit of a similar vibe, although you could say a lot of things are flipped. But I want to step back for a second from those, and I want to just talk about Animal Farm and get the story behind this one, because I think that the production history of it is really why it's on this list. As to, it's a prominent book that George Orwell wrote, but I think the nature of this animated adaptation of it, I think, speaks to this entire situation that we're looking at. Can you just kind of give us a brief rundown of why this film got made?
So Animal Farm, as a novel, came out in 1945, was a massive hit in America and in Britain. Orwell was a man of the left, of course, this is an allegory, a fable for what happened after the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalin took over and turned the Soviet Union into a dictatorship. But as well as, like 1984, his novel, which came out in 1949, both 1984 and Animal Farm were intended as critiques of totalitarianism, of dictatorships broadly, whether that's of the right or the left. So they were very popular, very well known. And Orwell dies in 1950, very early, dies only 46, dies of tuberculosis. And then pretty much immediately you get people interested in turning both Animal Farm and 1984 into films. And we now know, I was, I think, amongst the first of scholars to really dig into this and to digging into particular archives in the UK. Animal Farm was, as it was turned into an animation film and came out in 1954, it was made by a British animation team called Howells and Batchelor. And digging into their archives, I found that the CIA essentially had paid for the film, helped produce it, and had a large part in scripting it. So here we have the CIA working, of course, secretly to produce a British film. Better than using Disney, right? If you use Disney, it comes across as an American piece of propaganda. So their fingerprints weren't all over this at all. No one knew this at the time the film came out. The CIA had been involved. And what the CIA wants to do is to turn Animal Farm into an anti-totalitarian story, into an anti-Soviet story. And Animal Farm, the movie, does this in lots of different ways, but the best way is just looking at the film, just look at the end of it, the last 5 minutes of it. The last part of Orwell's book sees the pigs who basically are Stalin and his friends having taken over the farm, and they're having a meal with the humans. So in other words, those who they've revolted against and the pigs are now in control. At the end of the film, the beasts, the goats, the birds, the horses revolt, and crash into the farmhouse and destroy it. And what this was intended by the CIA was to send a message that those who are living under communism should revolt against it. In other words, it was designed as a scare story for those people who are thinking of becoming communists. This is what life will be like. And for those living under communism, even in the Eastern Bloc, this is what you should do. This is the mid-1950s, when the American government is trying to generate, dissent and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc.
And now we have a 2026 version coming out, and I don't know if it's even trying to say anything. I'm not honestly sure after watching the trailer.
Right. I don't know myself about that.
It looks like they've completely lost touch with the original message.
Really?
Yeah. I maybe I'm wrong, but the trailer didn't sell it well to me.
I mean, the film, the 1954 film was a great film. It was a landmark film. It was the first British animation feature. It was widely watched. It was not watched in the Eastern Bloc. The American CIA should have known that.
Yeah, right.
Like most Western films, it wasn't shown. But, and just from a personal perspective, I found it interesting because as a school kid in the 70s and 80s, I was shown that film to learn about George Orwell as a school child.
Interesting.
I was 30 odd years later, I found out that the film had been made by the CIA. And my interpretation of George Orwell
totally different
had been
skewed a bit. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Let's move into bucket C. I put the mind as the battlefield with the Manchurian Candidate in this one. I feel like this one kind of synthesizes so many of the things we're talking about. You've got domestic infiltration, you've got media spectacle, there's brainwashing, which we haven't really talked about at all, and then the machinery of democracy kind of turning back on itself. This film, it's interesting because it critiques McCarthyism and communism. It's paranoid about both sides. What is it really telling us about where American political anxiety was in 1962?
This of all of the films that we're talking about, I don't think there's any doubt this is the one film that's been talked about most by scholars.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
And it's the one film that scholars and mainstream viewers probably argue about as to what its overall message is. And of course, there's no overall. We can't agree on that. We don't have to agree on that. It's playing around. Frankenheimer was a really interesting director. Richard Condon, the novelist, deliberately wrote a very ambiguous novel. So it's very much connected to. We talked about the Korean War when we were talking about
My son John. Yeah.
Well, the Korean War, the thing to come out of the Korean War, which of course is directly related to the Manchurian Candidate, is a significant number of American POWs who were captured by the communists, the North Koreans, during the Korean War. A significant number of them who were imprisoned defected or came back saying critical things about their country. From that came this notion that these soldiers, could only have done that because they've been brainwashed by the Chinese, which of course fits into long sort of stereotypes about the representation of Chinese on the American screen. There's not much truth whatsoever behind this, but it really captured the imagination of lots of people in the West, particularly in America in the 1950s. And that's what the film is playing on more than anything else. The idea that the villain or the apparent villain in the film is working as a sleeper agent for the Chinese because he's been brainwashed a decade earlier. So that is the guiding spine of it, and I think that's what makes it a truly great and interesting Cold War film, because brainwashing, mind control, which touches beautifully on what we've been talking about the Cold War being a war on men's minds, whether that's in propaganda or through espionage and information control, all that sort of thing. But of course, you're right. At the same time, it's also critical of McCarthyism and the hysteria of McCarthyism. So it's critiquing the paranoia which we've been talking about for the last half an hour, which makes it's got so many different interesting levels to it as a Manchurian Candidate.
Well, obviously things were very raw when this film came out. And I think that's what's interesting because the real world history of this film is like after the Kennedy assassination, it was pulled. This movie was like not seen for decades because of how they were kind of felt so sensitive about all of these things. And I think that speaks to an interesting element. I mean, I know there's the connection between Sinatra and Kennedy, and I'm sure there was some thinking there, but I think it also just speaks to just real, like, raw anxiety people were still feeling.
Yeah, I have to confess, I don't know loads about its afterlife, but that doesn't surprise me, given that the shock that there was of the Kennedy assassination. And you're right, the closeness that a number of those involved in the film had towards Kennedy, and I presume by that a fear that there could be copycats.
Yeah, right.
Who might do something similar. So, it very much fits in with that. And it is coming towards the end of the period that we highlighted at the very outset. In other words, Cold War is beginning to dip a little, and to a degree, filmmakers are showing perhaps less interest in the Cold War as détente starts to emerge, or a sense of relaxation of relations between East and West. So perhaps there was less of a value for it, or an understanding that people would want to watch. But I get your point about it would be bad taste.
Yeah. Let's jump into our last bucket here. I've called it When the System Fails. We've got 3 interesting films in here: On the Beach, Fail Safe, and 7 Days in May. 2 of these nuclear stories, and one of them is a story about the institution kind of collapsing in on itself. I mean, I guess we'll start kind of like the nuclear elements. On the Beach is an interesting one because there's really no conspiracy. Everything is stripped down to the end point, right? The world is ending because of decisions that have already been made by this system that is no one controls. That kind of puts a mood over the entire film. And I think that, especially as we pair it with Failsafe, both are looking at, which is much more like, it's not after the fact, it is at the point of the decisions getting made where everything is malfunctioning and we have to make these decisions. Obviously, there's the whole Dr. Strangelove side of the conversation with Failsafe, but Failsafe certainly stands as a brilliant film all on its own. Talk about kind of like this, where were we as far as like the nuclear fears that generated both of these films as kind of part of this paranoia?
Yeah, something's happened, hasn't it? By the late 50s, by the early 60s, something big has happened in America for these two films to be made. I mean, you've gotten a number of films that were made in the late 40s and early 50s, or even into the late 50s, of films that many of them supported by the Pentagon and show the American Air Force in particular and its nuclear bombs as being sort of protectors of the peace, or atomic energy being something which would bring something wonderful and progressive to America. By the late 50s, we've started to get the emergence of anti-nuclear groups like SANE, or like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Britain, in part connected to nuclear testing. There are a number of accidents which are leaving people. There's famous acts, a so-called Lucky Dragon nuclear test near Japan in 1954, which Japanese sailors are caught up in. In other words, by the late 50s, people are beginning to question nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy in particular. You've got, because HUAC has largely disappeared from the scene, TV, as you mentioned right at the outset, is more of a competitor, is up in the game. Filmmakers are having to make more interesting films about nuclear weapons. Independent studios have emerged. Stanley Kramer, who makes On the Beach, is an example of an independent producer. So politically, things have changed. The industry has changed. And so you're getting really quite radical films. I mean, some people probably would disagree, but I think On the Beach is a really radical film for its time.
Sure, yeah.
A really moving take on the threat of nuclear Armageddon.
The inevitable end, right? Everything's...
The inevitable end, yeah. The war has already pretty much taken place, in contrast with Failsafe. You have scenes with Anthony Perkins, who plays an officer in it, having to essentially, or talking to his wife about what they're going to have to commit suicide and kill their child in the process, because the alternative is a horrible, horrible long death. You got Fred Astaire's character, who's a nuclear physicist. He gasses himself with these car exhaust fumes. I mean, this film doesn't pull punches.
No, it's a dark one, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not surprising, therefore, how, I mean, the Pentagon was asked to provide support. They, of course, said no. But the CIA even played a role. The CIA was asked to root around in the production to find out whether there had a communist element. They found there was none whatsoever. So the Eisenhower administration decided that it would therefore, once the film has been made, they didn't want the film made, but once it had been made, they decided they'd dump all over it. Eisenhower's administration wanted to do it openly, but then decided to do it more subtly by briefing against it, saying how this is not how things would work in reality.
Right. Of course. Of course not. Yeah.
So it's, it's politically deeply controversial.
And then 7 Days in May is an interesting one, looking at a military coup against a sitting president. And I think it's just an interesting one to throw into this grouping, because it's also this point, especially like coming at this point, Kennedy was apparently wanting this film to get made because he thought it was a plausible scenario, and then he is assassinated, and this comes out the year after his assassination. And I just think that's interesting because the president himself felt that this was a conversation worth having publicly and letting people know how this could go, and I find that to be an interesting element that fits into all of this paranoia that we're seeing it like within the system itself.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, one could argue it's an extension of a Manchurian Candidate, the threat to government, but this time from within. And there was much talk about the power of the military in this period. And I think it fits in with what, for instance, Eisenhower was saying just before he stepped down as president about the threat of the military-industrial complex. So the broad outlines of that sort of story would fit in. And again, if one's talking about, the way in which, for instance, Failsafe points a finger at the number of nuclear strategists who seem to be almost running the government's nuclear policy, then we can see why films like 7 Days in May can get made as well.
Absolutely. Let's just wrap up our conversation by just looking at where this cycle kind of goes after all of this. After all this paranoia hits kind of this peak at about 1965. I don't know. The way I saw it, it seems like there's two potential roads that things go. There's the darker road that leads into kind of the 70s conspiracy thrillers, like with Parallax View, 3 Days of the Condor, All the President's Men, Conversation. And then there's the release valve side of things. We already mentioned like James Bond with Dr. No showing up in 1962. And so there's definitely a shift with all of that. You had mentioned Bond when we were talking about these in our emails about these early British Cold War films. Do you see Bond as a reaction to all this, or is it just kind of a parallel track that happened with kind of popular culture war?
I don't think there's necessarily a connection. I don't think there's a sudden stop and start. I think I think obviously the Bond novels have been written long before the films appear, and the Bond. Some of these, as we know, some Bond films are more about the Cold War than others, and the Bond films are as much about Britain trying to show that it can still flex its muscles on the international scene, perhaps.
Right.
So, but perhaps there's a sense that the Cold War now, the representation, cinema's take on the Cold War has to change.
Yeah.
To a more entertaining angle, and you do get a number of these are largely British films. But you're starting to get even American-made Cold War comedies, like The Russians Are Coming, which are coming out.
Right, exactly.
So you've got the Cold War can be sort of played around with in a freer way than the orthodoxy would have allowed, let's say, particularly in the late 40s and 50s. And you're right. And then the Alan Pakula films and others, they're less about the Cold War to me. They're more about, hugely connected to Watergate.
Well, yeah, and I guess what I meant is it's just like the paranoia. It moves out of the Cold War and it kind of shifts into other just conspiracies.
Yeah. I get that. Yeah, although likes of the 3 Days of the Condor, that Robert Redford film, which, again, he's very much a dig at the enemy within. Now he's not communism, but is the CIA.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's just an interesting fork that kind of shifts how culture was processing Cold War anxiety by the mid-60s. Like, I think it makes sense that we've gone through an interesting period of some stories, and now we're going to find other ways to kind of explore them through other things. So, yeah, it's all very fascinating, I think. Well, Tony, this has been a genuinely illuminating conversation. Thank you so much for bringing all of this depth to this cycle, this period of paranoia thrillers. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy.
Anyone who wants to go deeper, check out Hollywood's Cold War, Tony's book. Again, Tony, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Next month, we are wrapping up this post-war miniseries with a look at post-war crime procedurals, the semi-documentary tradition, the institutional thriller, films that trusted the system even as they exposed its pressures. That's what's coming next month. Thank you for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the TruStory FM Entertainment Network. Music by Orcus and Max Hickson. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film shows at TruStory.fm. Follow at The Next Reel on social media, and if you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and review wherever you listen. As we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.